Isaiah 54:17. God's word cancels every evil plan against you. There are moments when life feels heavy without explanation. You wake up tired, even after resting. You sense resistance, even when nothing around you seems wrong. It's as if pressure is coming from a place you can't see, but you can feel it. That's because not every attack is visible. Some battles are planned in silence, some weapons are formed in the shadows, and some strategies against your life were never meant to reach your awareness. But hear this carefully. Before anything was formed against you, God already spoke about it. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Isaiah 54:17. This is not poetry. This is not symbolic language. This is a legal declaration from heaven. The verse does not say the weapon would never be formed. It says it would never succeed. That means plans were made, words were spoken, intentions were released, but none of them were authorized to determine your outcome. You may not know what was said behind your back. You may never discover what was planned in secret. But you are standing today because God canceled things you were never meant to confront. Some attacks failed before they reached you. Some doors closed because they were traps. Some delays were protection in disguise. And tonight, this word arrives to remind you of something essential. You are not surviving by chance. You are standing by covenant. If you felt resistance, it's because something was formed. If you are still standing, it's because God intervened. Stay here, because what God reveals next will explain what you felt and confirm why it didn't work. Before the attack ever reached your life, it reached the unseen. Before something tried to touch your future, it was already moving in silence. That's the part most people never understand. The most dangerous battles don't announce themselves. Some attacks don't come as chaos. They come as pressure, as confusion, as unexplained resistance. You didn't imagine it. You felt it because something was formed against you. Not every weapon looks like a disaster. Some look like delays that don't make sense. Some look like sudden misunderstandings. Some look like doors closing without warning. And some look like fatigue that hits your spirit, not your body. The enemy rarely attacks what has no value. He studies before he strikes. He observes before he acts. And when he sees a life aligned with purpose, he doesn't always move openly. He moves quietly. That's why the pressure felt strange. You weren't under attack in the natural. You were targeted in the spiritual. The Bible doesn't say the weapon wouldn't be formed. It says it wouldn't prosper. That means something was attempted, but it failed. There were words spoken that never reached their destination. There were plans designed that collapsed before execution. There were intentions released that lost their power midair. You didn't see the battle, but heaven did. You didn't hear the conversation, but God did. You didn't know what was forming, but it was already being restricted. Sometimes, the reason you felt emotional weight without a clear cause is because something was happening beyond your awareness. A strategy was unfolding and being dismantled at the same time. That's why you felt tension, but not destruction, resistance, but not defeat, pressure, but not collapse. You were in a battlefield you never entered, because God fought it for you. There are moments when the enemy tries to weaken you before he ever touches your circumstances. If he can drain your strength, he hopes you'll surrender before the battle even becomes visible. If he can confuse your mind, he hopes you'll abandon what God promised. If he can make you question yourself, he hopes you'll step out of alignment. But you're still here, and that is not accidental. The fact that you didn't break is proof that something intercepted the attack. The fact that you didn't quit is evidence that something failed. The fact that you're listening now means the plan didn't work. You may never know how close it came. You may never understand how it was formed. But you don't need to, because protection doesn't require your awareness, only God's authority. Some of the greatest victories in your life happened without applause. No celebration, no explanation, just quiet preservation. You kept moving forward, unaware that heaven was shutting things down behind the scenes. You kept praying, unaware that angels were already intervening. You kept trusting, unaware that the outcome had been sealed. That's why the pressure lifted without explanation. That's why things didn't escalate. That's why what should have destroyed you didn't. This was never about luck. It was never about coincidence. It was never about you being strong enough. It was about divine interference. And now, as this truth settles in, something shifts inside you. Because once you understand that battles were fought without your involvement, fear loses its grip, anxiety loses its authority, and peace starts to make sense. What was formed didn't prosper. What was planned didn't advance. What was released didn't finish its assignment. You were protected, even when you didn't know you needed it. And this is only the beginning of what God is about to reveal. When something is formed against a life, it is never random. Weapons are not created without motive. They are shaped with intention, directed by purpose, and released because something valuable was identified. The enemy does not waste resources. He studies first. He observes patterns. He waits for alignment. And when he sees a life moving in rhythm with God, he reacts. That is why the verse matters so much. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Isaiah 54:17. Notice what it implies. If a weapon was formed, it's because something in you posed a threat to darkness. The attack was never proof of weakness. It was evidence of value. Weapons are formed where purpose exists. Strategies are built where destiny is active. Opposition rises where progress is inevitable. Some people mistake resistance as a sign to retreat. But in the spiritual realm, resistance is often confirmation that you are moving in the right direction. The enemy does not fight potential. He fights momentum. He doesn't attack what might become something one day. He attacks what is already in motion. That's why the pressure intensified when you started moving forward. That's why things shifted when you chose obedience. That's why the atmosphere changed when you committed to what God asked of you. The weapon was formed because your life crossed a line where fear no longer controlled you, a line where faith started shaping your decisions, a line where your obedience threatened the enemy's influence. And when that happens, the response is strategic. Sometimes the weapon comes as accusation, sometimes as discouragement, sometimes as isolation, sometimes as delay, not to destroy you instantly, but to slow you down long enough to make you doubt yourself. The enemy understands something many people don't. If he can interrupt your confidence, he can interrupt your consistency. If he can distort your perception, he can derail your purpose. If he can exhaust you emotionally, he can weaken you spiritually. That's why the weapon was formed quietly, not to draw attention, not to cause chaos, but to wear you down from the inside. Yet here is the truth that changes everything. Formation does not equal permission. Just because something was formed does not mean it was approved. Just because a plan existed does not mean it was authorized to succeed. God saw the weapon before it was finished. God judged the plan before it was released. God canceled the assignment before it reached completion. That's why the verse does not promise absence of attack. It promises absence of success. The enemy formed it, but God limited it. And that limitation is the reason you are still standing with clarity instead of confusion, with peace instead of panic, with direction instead of despair. Some attacks were meant to stop you completely. Instead, they refined you. Some pressures were meant to silence you. Instead, they strengthened your discernment. Some strategies were meant to break your faith. Instead, they exposed how protected you truly are. The weapon was formed because something in you carries impact. Something in you moves heaven's agenda forward. Something in you cannot be ignored by the spiritual realm. And now, instead of fearing the fact that it was formed, you begin to understand it. The weapon wasn't proof that God stepped away. It was proof that God was already involved. Because what God allows to be formed, He also limits. And what He limits, He does not allow to prosper. That is why the attack didn't finish its work. That is why the pressure didn't consume you. That is why the plan collapsed before it reached full force. The weapon was formed, but it was never meant to win. And in the next moment, you'll understand exactly why it failed. There is a powerful distinction hidden inside Isaiah 54:17 that many people overlook. The verse never denies the formation of the weapon. It denies its authority. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Isaiah 54:17. Formed does not mean approved. Created does not mean empowered. Planned does not mean permitted. Something can exist and still be forbidden from succeeding. This is where fear loses its argument, because fear assumes that if something was formed, it must be allowed to finish its work. But God draws a clear line between presence and permission. The weapon existed, but it was restricted. The plan was outlined, but it was limited. The strategy was released, but it was intercepted. That means the attack was real, but its authority was not. There are things that are allowed to approach your life only far enough to reveal God's protection. They come close enough to make you aware of your dependence on Him, but never close enough to define your outcome. You may have felt the proximity of danger. You may have sensed the pressure of opposition. You may have realized that something was trying to influence your path, but it stopped where God said it would stop. Authorization is what determines outcome, and the enemy never had it. He can form weapons, but he cannot grant them permission. He can release words, but he cannot give them power. He can attempt strategies, but he cannot override covenant. That's why the verse doesn't say the weapon won't touch you. It says it won't prosper. Prosper means advance. Prosper means succeed. Prosper means finish what it started. And nothing formed against you was allowed to finish. Some attacks were cut short. Some plans stalled unexpectedly. Some threats lost momentum without explanation. That wasn't coincidence. That was divine restriction. God didn't need to announce His intervention. He didn't need to expose the enemy's plan publicly. He simply limited it. And limitation is often God's quietest form of power. There are moments when God doesn't remove the weapon immediately, because He wants to show you that even its presence is under His control. It came close, but not closer than He allowed. It tried, but not further than He permitted. It existed, but never ruled. That's why panic didn't overtake you. That's why collapse never came. That's why the situation didn't spiral. You were standing inside a boundary drawn by God Himself. And when something is restricted by God, it doesn't matter how strong it looks, how calculated it seems, or how intentional it was formed. Without authorization, it cannot prosper. This changes how you interpret pressure, because pressure no longer means danger. It means limitation. It means the attack reached its maximum distance and went no further. It means the enemy encountered resistance he couldn't override. It means the outcome was decided before the conflict ever surfaced. That's why some things ended abruptly. That's why certain threats faded without resolution. That's why situations that seemed serious dissolved quietly. They were never authorized to continue. And now, as you understand this, fear begins to lose its voice. Because fear only survives where authority is unclear. But authority is clear here. God did not approve the weapon. God did not sign off on the plan. God did not allow the outcome. What was formed was restricted. What was planned was blocked. What was released was neutralized. And that's why you are still standing, not wounded, not broken, not defeated, but preserved. The weapon was real, but the authority was God's. And what God does not authorize will never prosper. Some of the most dangerous plans against your life never reached your awareness, not because they didn't exist, but because they were canceled before revelation. There are battles God never allows you to see, because knowing about them would only create fear, not faith. So He intervenes quietly. He dismantles silently. He erases assignments without explanation. You never heard the conversation. You never saw the setup. You never noticed the moment it was forming. And that was mercy. Protection doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it works best when it stays hidden. There were discussions that ended suddenly, decisions that changed without reason, opportunities that disappeared just before becoming traps. At the time, it may have felt confusing, like something didn't make sense, like a door closed too fast, or a situation shifted without warning. But now you understand. What felt like interruption was intervention. God canceled things you were never meant to confront. If you had known what was forming, fear might have overtaken you. If you had seen the plan, anxiety might have distracted you. If you had heard the intent, peace might have been stolen. So God stepped in early. He doesn't always reveal what He removes. He doesn't always expose what He cancels. Because His goal isn't to impress you with danger. It's to preserve you in peace. There are plans that die in the planning stage, words that lose power before being spoken, assignments that are revoked before activation, and you walk forward unaware that a threat ever existed. That's why some seasons ended without closure. That's why certain people drifted away unexpectedly. That's why some paths felt blocked even when they looked promising. You weren't being denied. You were being defended. God knew what access would cost you. He knew what staying connected would drain from you. He knew what stepping into that situation would expose. So he canceled it. You may have wondered why things didn't move forward the way you expected. Why momentum stopped suddenly. Why progress slowed without explanation. But delays are often God's way of removing danger without alarming you. Not everything that doesn't work out is loss. Some things don't work out because they were working against you. And God will never allow something that threatens your calling to reach full strength. That's why you didn't collapse under pressure. That's why confusion didn't consume you. That's why the outcome never became destructive. The plan never matured. The weapon never advanced. The strategy never reached execution. It was canceled quietly. This is what divine protection looks like when it's working perfectly. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, nothing loud. Just preservation. You kept moving forward while danger was being removed behind the scenes. You kept trusting while God was rearranging outcomes you didn't even know needed rearranging. You kept praying while heaven was already intervening. And now, instead of fear, clarity begins to rise. Because when you realize that threats were handled without your involvement, you stop trying to control everything. You stop replaying every possibility. You stop anticipating disaster. Peace settles in, not because life is perfect, but because protection is active. God did not wait for the plan to become obvious. He canceled it before it gained momentum. He removed it before it gained authority. He dismantled it before it gained access. And that's why some battles never showed up. That's why some storms never formed. That's why some attacks never reached your door. They were canceled in silence. And the fact that you never discovered them is proof that God handled them exactly the way He intended. Peace is often misunderstood. Many people think peace means nothing is happening. But in the spiritual realm, peace usually means something already happened, and you were spared from it. Peace is not the absence of battle. It is the evidence that the battle was handled. There are moments when calm settles over you without explanation. No sudden breakthrough, no dramatic resolution. Just a quiet sense that things are going to be okay. That calm is not emotional relief. It is confirmation, because if the attack had authority, peace would not be possible. If the plan had permission, rest would not exist. If the weapon had power, fear would still be active. But peace showed up instead. Peace is heaven's signature after intervention. That's why some of your most protected seasons looked uneventful on the outside. Nothing extraordinary happened. Nothing explosive changed. Yet inside you felt held. That was not stagnation. That was stabilization. God often releases peace not after the storm, but after canceling it. And since there was no visible chaos, you assumed nothing was happening. But peace was the signal that something dangerous was removed. You may have wondered why your heart suddenly felt lighter, why anxiety lost intensity, why the pressure faded without explanation. That wasn't time healing you. That was protection working. Peace doesn't come from circumstances improving. It comes from threats being neutralized. That's why you can feel peace even when nothing around you changed. The environment stayed the same. But the risk didn't. Something that could have escalated was stopped. Something that could have drained you was cut off. Something that could have shaken you was restrained. And your spirit responded with peace. Peace is not passive. It is not weakness. It is not indifference. Peace is authority resting. When peace arrives, it means control has been established. It means boundaries have been enforced. It means limits have been placed. That's why fear couldn't stay. Fear only survives where authority is uncertain. But peace settles where authority is clear. You didn't calm yourself down. You didn't convince yourself everything was fine. You didn't force optimism. Peace arrived on its own, because the outcome was already decided. This is why peace often comes before understanding. God doesn't wait for your mind to catch up before protecting you. He secures the outcome first, then lets peace inform your spirit. And later, clarity follows. That's why you couldn't explain the calm. You just felt it. That calm was not emotional numbness. It was spiritual assurance. Peace is God's way of saying, it's handled. You're covered. It won't reach you. And once peace settles, panic loses its influence. Anxiety loses credibility. Overthinking loses urgency. Because peace does not argue, it occupies. The enemy wants reaction. God releases peace. Reaction creates confusion. Peace creates alignment. That's why you didn't spiral. That's why your thoughts didn't collapse. That's why your faith didn't break under pressure. Peace held the line. Some people assume that if peace comes too easily, it must be denial. But denial is fragile. Peace is stable. Denial cracks under pressure. Peace remains when pressure tests it. You are not at peace because nothing is happening. You are at peace because what mattered already happened. Protection doesn't always look like visible rescue. Sometimes it looks like quiet rest, and that rest is not accidental. It is intentional. God released peace to signal completion. Completion of an intervention you never saw. Completion of a cancellation you never detected. Completion of a battle you never fought. And now, peace stands as proof that what was formed did not prosper. You don't need to revisit what almost happened. You don't need to analyze what could have been. You don't need to imagine worst-case outcomes. Peace already testified on your behalf. And when peace testifies, fear has no case. This calm you feel is not temporary. It is not fragile. It is not dependent on circumstances. It is the after effect of divine protection. And from this place of peace, clarity will begin to rise. Because once protection is established, purpose can move forward. There is a reason the attack didn't advance, a reason the pressure stalled, a reason the threat never reached full force. Prosperity requires momentum, and momentum requires permission. The weapon may have been formed, but it never gained traction. It never found agreement. It never received authorization to move forward. In the spiritual realm, nothing prospers by effort alone. It prospers by alignment, and what was formed against you was never aligned with God's will. That's why it struggled. That's why it slowed down. That's why it lost intensity over time instead of gaining strength. You may have expected things to escalate, but instead, they weakened. That's not normal in the natural. Threats usually grow when they're fed. Opposition usually intensifies when it's working. But this didn't. Because prosperity does not respond to intention alone. It responds to authority. And authority was never granted. What tried to advance against you ran into resistance it couldn't overcome. Not resistance from people, not resistance from circumstances, but resistance from God Himself. Prosperity means continuation. It means sustainability. It means the ability to remain active and effective over time. And none of that was allowed. The attack had a beginning, but it was denied a future. It had form, but it was denied force. It had intention, but it was denied impact. That's why it couldn't last. Some things can start strong and still fail. Some things can look dangerous and still collapse. Some threats can appear serious and still dissolve quietly. Because without God's approval, nothing has endurance. You may have noticed how quickly the situation lost momentum, how the urgency faded, how the intensity dropped without explanation. That wasn't because the enemy changed his mind. It was because the assignment expired. God does not always destroy things instantly. Sometimes He simply removes their ability to continue. And when momentum is removed, prosperity becomes impossible. This is why you didn't have to fight constantly, why you weren't forced into endless defense, why exhaustion never fully overtook you. The situation couldn't sustain itself. What was formed was running on borrowed time, and borrowed time always runs out. That's why the verse doesn't say the weapon won't exist. It says it won't prosper. Existence is temporary, prosperity is ongoing, and God blocked the ongoing part. Some attacks fail not because they were weak, but because they were unsupported. They had no backing, no reinforcement, no permission to continue. And when support is removed, collapse is inevitable. This changes how you interpret delay, because sometimes delay isn't waiting, it's decay. What felt like nothing happening was actually something losing power. The longer it stayed inactive, the weaker it became. Until eventually, it could no longer function. That's why it ended without drama. That's why it faded instead of exploding. That's why it didn't leave lasting damage. It simply couldn't prosper. Prosperity requires cooperation between effort and authority never joined the plan. God didn't argue with the weapon. He didn't negotiate with the plan. He didn't confront it publicly. He withdrew permission. And without permission, nothing advances. This is why you can move forward without fear of revival. Why you don't need to look over your shoulder. Why you don't need to brace for a return. What didn't prosper once won't suddenly prosper later. Because God doesn't revoke his decisions. What he stops, stays stopped. What he limits stays limited. What he blocks stays blocked. And now, instead of wondering if it will come back, you can rest, knowing why it didn't work. It didn't prosper because it wasn't allowed to. And when God denies prosperity, no amount of effort can reverse it. There is a truth many people struggle to accept. God does not defend everything. He defends what he chooses. Protection is not random. It is selective, intentional, covenantal. When God places his hand on a life, he takes responsibility for its outcome. What he chooses, he covers. What he covers, he defends. And what he defends, no opposing force can override. This is why the attack didn't succeed, not because it wasn't strong, but because it wasn't permitted to touch what belonged to God. Chosen lives carry a different kind of security, not because they are perfect, but because they are assigned. When something is assigned by God, it becomes guarded by God. He doesn't outsource that responsibility. He doesn't delegate it. He enforces it personally. That's why the pressure you faced didn't break you. That's why the opposition you encountered didn't finish its work. That's why the weapon lost its effectiveness. You were not unprotected. You were chosen. God does not defend based on merit. He defends based on purpose. And purpose creates jurisdiction. Once something falls under God's jurisdiction, the rules change. The enemy can approach, but he cannot overstep. He can attempt, but he cannot conclude. That's what it means to be chosen. The defense didn't activate because you prayed perfectly. It didn't activate because you were strong enough. It activated because God made a decision. And once God decides, outcomes adjust. This is why some attacks stop abruptly. Why some threats dissolve without confrontation. Why some strategies collapse without explanation. They crossed into territory they were not authorized to operate in. God defends what carries his purpose because he is invested in its completion. He will not allow what he started to be aborted by opposition. And when he defends, he does it thoroughly, not halfway, not temporarily, not conditionally. He enforces boundaries the enemy cannot negotiate. That's why the verse doesn't say the weapon will be weakened. It says it will not prosper. Prosperity requires access, and access was denied. God didn't just stop the outcome. He blocked the process. Some people wonder why their lives attract resistance, why progress triggers pressure, why alignment brings opposition. It's because purpose draws attention. What is chosen becomes targeted, but what is targeted becomes defended. This is the paradox of calling. The same reason the weapon was formed is the reason it failed. Because when God chooses, he also commits. And commitment is what guarantees protection. God does not protect casually. He protects deliberately. He does not watch from a distance. He stands as defender. That's why the attack didn't overwhelm you. That's why collapse never arrived. That's why the outcome shifted in your favor. You were not left alone in the battle. You were never expected to fight it. God stepped in because the assignment mattered to him. And when God defends, he doesn't just neutralize the threat. He preserves the future. That's why you can move forward without fear. Why you don't need to revisit what almost happened. Why you don't need to prepare for a repeat. What God defends stays defended. The choice has already been made. The line has already been drawn. The decision has already been enforced. And nothing formed against what God chose will ever prosper. This promise was never meant to stay general. It was never designed to float in theory. It was spoken with a destination in mind. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. That word "you" is not symbolic. It is personal, specific, intentional. God does not issue blanket declarations without knowing exactly who they will cover. Every promise carries an address, every protection has a recipient, and this one found you. This verse was not written to comfort crowds. It was written to secure individuals, to speak directly into moments where someone would need certainty more than explanation. This is why it resonates so deeply, why it feels targeted, why it seems to describe your situation with unsettling accuracy, because it does. The enemy formed a weapon with your name in mind, but God spoke a promise with your future in mind, and the future always outranks the attack. When Scripture says against you, it acknowledges reality. It doesn't deny opposition. It doesn't minimize pressure. It recognizes that something was aimed directly at your life, but then it removes its power. God does not protect in vague terms. He protects personally. He knows the exact moment the plan was formed, the precise intention behind it, the specific area it was meant to damage, and he responded accordingly. This is why the promise feels alive, because it is active. It is not a historical statement. It is a living verdict that continues to enforce itself in real time. You were not spared by accident. You were covered by design. And that design included your name, your path, your calling, your future. Some people assume Scripture works like a suggestion, but this verse functions like a ruling. It doesn't encourage hope. It establishes outcome. What was formed against you did not prosper, not in your mind, not in your relationships, not in your purpose, not in your future. It may have tried to attach itself. It may have attempted to influence direction, but it failed to gain authority, because this promise did not leave room for negotiation. When God speaks protection over a life, He doesn't wait to see how things turn out. He defines how they will end. That's why you didn't have to prove anything, why you weren't required to defend yourself endlessly, why the situation resolved without you fighting every angle. The promise was already working, and now, as you realize this, something settles inside you. Relief, clarity, certainty. Because knowing that a promise carries your name removes doubt from the equation. You stop asking, "Does this apply to me?" You start declaring, "This was spoken for me." This is where fear dissolves. Fear survives on uncertainty, but certainty silences it completely. The promise has a name, and it's yours, which means the protection wasn't optional, it wasn't conditional, it wasn't temporary, it was enforced. And enforced promises don't expire. This is why the threat didn't return stronger, why the pressure didn't resurface, why the cycle didn't repeat. Because once a promise is fulfilled, it does not reopen itself for revision. What God spoke over you remains in effect. And now, instead of bracing for impact, you can move forward with confidence. Not because you assume nothing will ever challenge you again, but because you know nothing that does will prosper. The promise already accounted for opposition, and it still chose you. There is something final about the way God cancels things. When He intervenes, He doesn't pause outcomes, He ends them. When He steps in, He doesn't delay destruction, He removes authority. What God cancels does not come back stronger. It does not return quietly. It does not wait for another opportunity. Cancellation in God is not temporary restraint. It is permanent removal of permission. Many people live in fear of recurrence. They assume that what failed once might return later with more force, that what didn't work before could try again in a different form. But that fear misunderstands how divine cancellation works. When God cancels an assignment, He does not suspend it. He revokes it, and revoked assignments cannot be reissued. This is why you didn't see a second wave, why the pressure didn't circle back, why the threat didn't reinvent itself. It wasn't regrouping, it was finished. God does not leave loose ends where your future is concerned. He does not allow unfinished threats to linger in the background. He closes what He stops. That's why peace remained instead of anxiety returning. That's why clarity stayed instead of confusion resurfacing. That's why stability replaced anticipation of disaster. When something is canceled by God, it loses access, not just power. Access is what allows return, and access was denied. The enemy does not have unlimited attempts. He operates within boundaries he cannot change, and once God establishes a boundary, it becomes law. That's why Scripture doesn't say the weapon won't prosper this time. It says it will not prosper. Period. No conditions, no expiration, no revision. The authority was removed completely. Some people fear that silence means something is building again. But silence in this case is confirmation. When God is done, there is no noise left behind, no echo, no residue, no unfinished business. The situation didn't fade because it lost interest. It ended because it lost authorization. And once authorization is removed, nothing can revive it. This is why you don't need to monitor the past, why you don't need to scan for signs of return, why you don't need to rehearse old fears. What was canceled cannot re-enter your life. God does not cancel halfway. He cancels completely. That means the cycle is broken, the pattern is interrupted, the strategy is invalidated. And when a strategy is invalidated, it cannot be reused. This is where trust deepens, because trust isn't believing God will act again. It's knowing He already finished acting. You don't wait for confirmation. You live from it. The enemy relies on memory to keep fear alive. God relies on finality to keep peace intact. And finality is what you received. That's why this moment feels different. Why you don't feel the same tension. Why your body, your mind, your spirit aren't bracing anymore. Your system recognizes closure, not emotional closure, spiritual closure. Something ended at the root, and because it ended at the root, nothing grows back. This is the confidence Isaiah 54:17 establishes. Not just that the weapon fails, but that it has no future. What God cancels does not return. What He removes does not reappear. What He ends does not reopen. And now, as this truth settles, fear no longer has a timeline to work with. There is nothing pending, nothing waiting, nothing hidden preparing another attempt. It's done. And in the next moment, we seal this truth, not with explanation, but with prayer. Now take a moment. Slow your breathing. Let everything you've heard settle inside you. Because this is not just information, this is a sealing. Father God, we come before you not in fear, but in trust, not asking you to act, but thanking you because you already did. You saw what was formed in secret. You heard what was spoken in silence. You knew every intention, every plan, every strategy released against this life. And before it could prosper, you canceled it. Right now, in the authority of your word, we declare, every weapon formed against this person has lost its power. Every plan released in darkness has been revoked. Every accusation spoken in the unseen has been silenced. What you canceled is canceled forever. What you blocked is blocked completely. What you ended will never return. Let peace settle where fear once lived. Let clarity replace confusion. Let rest flow into places that carried tension for too long. We declare that this life is covered, not temporarily, but permanently. Covered by covenant, covered by purpose, covered by your decision. No fear will reattach, no anxiety will resurface, no shadow from the past will regain access. Because what you defend remains defended. Father, seal this truth in the heart, the mind, and the spirit. Let your peace stand as a guard. Let your presence remain as assurance. Let your word continue enforcing what you already declared. And from this moment forward, may this person walk without bracing for impact, without expecting loss, without anticipating attack, because the weapon did not prosper, and it never will. We receive this promise. We rest in this protection. We trust in your authority. For the honor and glory of the eternal. Amen. This is not the end. It's the beginning of something new. Stay here. Remain connected. Because the next word may change everything. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss what God is about to reveal next.